75 million lives gone. A third of Europe erased in just a few years. No war, no conqueror, no king, only a silent killer that no one could understand. It struck without warning, spreading through ships, through markets, through the very air. Villages emptied overnight. Cities became graveyards. And in the shadows of fear, Europe was changed forever. Before the shadow fell, Europe was alive with movement. Merchants crowded the ports of Venice and Genoa. Caravans rolled across the Alps carrying wool, wine, and salt. Cathedrals soared above bustling towns, their bells echoing across narrow streets. It was an age of growth, an age when many believed the future belonged to them. The population had swelled to numbers unseen since Roman times. Peasants worked every patch of land, carving new fields from forests and marshes. Children filled the villages with laughter, while markets overflowed with voices bargaining over grain and spices. Europe, at the dawn of the 14th century, felt unstoppable. But prosperity can be fragile. Winters grew colder, rains heavier, crops failed, and famine crept across the countryside. The poor, weakened by hunger, became restless. Whispers of discontent stirred against lords and kings. And in the south, in the harbors where ships from Asia unloaded their cargo, a silent threat was waiting. Unseen, it clung to the fur of rats that scurried in the dark corners of every ship. It nestled in the bellies of fleas, invisible to the human eye. No one could hear it. No one could see it. Yet it was already moving, riding the very arteries of Europe's wealth, following the trade routes that had made kingdoms rich. The danger was not an army, it was not a war, it was something far more ruthless. And soon it would turn all of Europe's noise and life into silence. The year was 1347. In October, 12 trading ships from Genoa anchored in the harbor of Messina on the island of Sicily. But when the people of Messina gathered to welcome them, they saw a vision of horror unlike anything they had ever known. The ships were ghostly. Sails hung torn and filthy. The stench of rot drifted across the harbor. When dock workers climbed aboard, they recoiled in terror. The decks were strewn with the dead and the dying. Men writhed in agony, their bodies swollen with enormous black buboes, painful lumps that oozed pus and blood. Others were already still, their skin mottled and dark, their mouths frozen open as if gasping for air in their final moment. The few survivors begged for help, coughing blood onto the planks beneath them. It was as if the ships had carried a plague straight from the underworld. The city leaders panicked. They ordered the ships to leave immediately. But the damage had already been done. Rats scurried down the ropes and into the alleys. Fleas jumped to new hosts. The plague had already stepped onto Sicilian soil. Messina was doomed. What followed was panic. Shops closed overnight. Families barricaded themselves indoors. Church bells rang without pause, announcing death after death. Neighbors refused to touch each other or even speak. Some fled into the countryside, believing they could outrun the sickness. Others sought the mercy of priests, confessing sins in desperation. But wherever they went, the plague followed. From Messina, the disease traveled like wildfire. By December, it reached Genoa, the proud merchant city whose ships had carried the plague from the east. There, the markets fell silent. Priests collapsed at the altar mid-sermon. Doctors in long robes and bird-like masks moved through the streets, but their potions and herbs were powerless. The dying could not be saved. Then it struck Venice. The city of canals, the jewel of the Adriatic, became a floating tomb. Gondolas carried bodies instead of passengers. Entire districts were abandoned as death claimed thousands. At night, the sound of wailing carried across the water. And with every sunrise, the death carts came again, hauling corpses to mass graves dug outside the city walls. Florence, too, became a vision of the apocalypse. The chronicler Giovanni Vianney, who had written of the city's wealth and splendor, fell victim to the plague himself. Boccaccio later described what he saw: families refusing to tend to their own sick, brothers abandoning sisters, parents leaving their children. The bonds of love and duty dissolved under the weight of terror, and still the plague spread further. By early 1348, the sickness had leapt from Italy into France and Spain. Merchants unknowingly carried it north along the trade routes. From Marseille to Paris, from Barcelona to Castile, the story repeated itself. Sudden illness, black swellings, rivers of blood coughed from the lungs, and death within days. No army could be fought. No border could be defended. The disease moved faster than any messenger, striking without mercy. Across the continent, confusion reigned. Some believed the air itself was poisoned, corrupted by an alignment of the planets. Others swore it was punishment from God. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned the wells, and violence began to brew. Meanwhile, the Church, the greatest authority of the age, found itself powerless. Prayers, processions, holy relics, none of it stopped the dying. Faith, which had once been Europe's strongest foundation, now seemed fragile in the face of this invisible terror. Everywhere the same sights appeared. Carts piled high with bodies, pits filled with the dead, whole villages left silent. From Messina to Marseille, from Florence to Paris, the Black Death had begun its terrible march across Europe, and the continent would never be the same. As the plague spread, the very structure of medieval society began to crumble. The laws that had governed towns and kingdoms seemed powerless against an invisible enemy. Markets emptied, fields went untended, and entire villages vanished. Life itself was unraveling. Fear became the ruler of Europe. In every city, people searched desperately for someone to blame. Neighbors looked upon each other with suspicion. Foreigners were accused of carrying poison. Merchants were beaten in the streets. And soon, one group became the target of a rising storm of violence: the Jews. Rumors spread like fire. Whispers claimed that Jewish communities had poisoned wells to kill Christians. In truth, the Jews were victims of the plague just like everyone else. But fear is rarely guided by truth. Across Germany, France, and Spain, mobs attacked Jewish neighborhoods. Entire communities were burned alive. Synagogues were destroyed. Those who survived were driven into exile. The plague was not only killing bodies, it was tearing apart the fragile bonds of society. Others responded not with violence, but with desperation. The flagellants appeared, bands of men who marched from town to town, whipping themselves with iron-tipped scourges. They believed that the plague was God's punishment, and that only through suffering could humanity be saved. Crowds gathered to watch them march, chanting hymns as blood dripped onto the stones. For a moment, hope flickered that their sacrifice might turn God's wrath aside. But the plague did not stop. It marched on, indifferent to prayer, indifferent to pain. Meanwhile, the Church, the greatest authority of the Middle Ages, faced a crisis like no other. Priests died in staggering numbers, often while tending to the sick. Monasteries were emptied. Those who remained could offer no cure, no protection. The faithful, once confident in the power of relics and blessings, now began to doubt. Why would God allow such suffering? Why would he strike down the innocent alongside the guilty? Questions that had no answer gnawed at the very foundations of belief. Daily life collapsed. Fathers abandoned their families. Children were left to die alone. In many places, the only ones willing to handle the dead were criminals, paid with gold to haul corpses to pits. The sound of funeral bells became so constant that in some towns, they simply stopped ringing them. There were too many dead to count. Chroniclers wrote of dogs and pigs wandering through streets filled with bodies, of ships drifting into harbors with every sailor dead, their vessels left to rot, of nobles fleeing their castles, only to find the plague waiting for them in the countryside. Nowhere was safe. No one was beyond its reach. In the face of such terror, time itself seemed broken. The rhythms of the seasons, planting, harvest, feast days, weddings, were forgotten. The calendar of human life was replaced with a single constant: death. The old order of Europe, built on faith, feudal duty, and community, was collapsing before the eyes of its people. And still, the Black Death spread further, reaching new lands, new victims, and leaving only silence in its wake. By 1348, the Black Death had crossed into France and Spain, and from there, it struck its next target, England. In June, the first reports came from the south coast. A ship arrived in Dorset. Soon after, strange swellings appeared among the townsfolk. Within weeks, the disease was in London. The city, already crowded and filthy, was a perfect breeding ground. Narrow streets became rivers of infection. The air itself seemed poisoned. Chroniclers described London's markets falling silent. Merchants vanished. Guild halls locked their doors. The great Cathedral of St. Paul's echoed not with sermons, but with funeral chants. Every morning, carts rolled through the streets, their drivers shouting, "Bring out your dead!" Bodies were heaped inside, carried to pits outside the city walls. One chronicler claimed that over 50,000 were buried in a single cemetery, an ocean of corpses beneath the soil. The countryside fared no better. Villages lost half their population. Fields lay abandoned. Cattle wandered untended. Without hands to work the land, harvests failed. Famine followed pestilence, tightening the grip of despair. England's population shrank so drastically that in some regions, entire settlements vanished from the map, never to be rebuilt. Across the Channel, Germany was engulfed. Here the plague not only killed, but ignited fury. Accusations against Jews reached their height. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a single day, their deaths cheered on by crowds desperate for someone to blame. But even after the massacres, the plague did not relent. It swept through towns along the Rhine, into the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, leaving silence in its wake. In 1349, the sickness pressed northward, into the Low Countries in Scandinavia. Norway was struck when a ship drifted into Bergen, its crew already dead or dying. From there, the plague traveled up the fjords, into remote villages that had never before felt the hand of war or famine. Even in these distant lands, death found its way. No corner of Europe was spared. The symptoms were always the same: a sudden fever, burning hot, buboes swelling beneath the skin until they split, a stench so foul it clung to the body. Then came delirium, coughing, rivers of blood. For most, death arrived within 3 to 5 days. For some, it came in a single night. Entire households vanished as if erased from existence. By 1350, the Black Death had reached its peak. In every kingdom, death was the constant. France lost nearly half its people. England, perhaps the same. Germany and Scandinavia saw whole regions gutted of life. Historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population, over 25 million souls, were gone. The living walked among the dead, and the world seemed to be ending. The Europe that emerged from this storm would not be the same. The plague had broken the old order. The question now was, what would rise from the ruins? When the storm of death began to subside, Europe was a different world. The plague had not only killed millions, it had transformed the very fabric of society. First, the numbers. Entire villages had vanished, abandoned to weeds and silence. Historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's people were gone. In England alone, so many died that whole settlements were left deserted. In France, harvests rotted in the fields for lack of hands to gather them. The sound of church bells faded, not because there were fewer deaths, but because there were fewer living souls to ring them. This sudden collapse of population had profound consequences. Labor was scarce. Where once peasants had been tied to the land, bound to lords by duty and tradition, now they found themselves in demand. Survivors could bargain for higher wages, for better conditions, for freedom to move to new lands. The great estates of nobles stood half empty, their power weakened. The old order of feudalism began to crack under the weight of change. In England, this shift would soon erupt into open revolt. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was fueled in part by the new confidence of survivors, men and women who had seen death up close and no longer bowed as easily to authority. The plague had given them a voice, and though rulers tried to silence it, the echoes would carry into the centuries to come. The church too was shaken. During the plague, priests had died in terrible numbers. Many of those who remained had failed to provide comfort or had fled in fear. People who had once trusted in relics and prayers now questioned their power. Some turned to mysticism, searching for answers beyond the church's walls. Others turned inward, placing their faith not in institutions, but in reason and observation. The seeds of a new way of thinking, what would one day become the Renaissance, were sown in this soil of doubt and survival. Art and literature bore the mark of the plague. Writers like Boccaccio captured the horror in vivid detail, recording not just the death, but the despair, the corruption, and the collapse of morality. Painters filled their works with images of skeletons, of death dancing with kings and peasants alike. The theme was clear: death spared no one. And in this grim equality, people began to question the rigid hierarchies that had ruled their lives. Psychologically, the plague left deep scars. For some, it bred fatalism, the belief that life was short, uncertain, and best lived in pleasure before death arrived. For others, it inspired a grim piety, a return to strict devotion in hopes of avoiding damnation. But in all cases, the illusion of stability was broken. Europe had been forced to see its own fragility, its own mortality on a scale never before imagined. The Black Death was more than a disease, it was a turning point. It dismantled the old medieval order, feudal bonds, unquestioned faith, the illusion of permanence, and laid the foundations for something new. The world that emerged from the plague was wounded, scarred, but also transformed. From these ruins, Europe would stagger forward into a new age, and the shadow of the plague would linger long after the graves had closed. When the plague finally loosened its grip, Europe was scarred not only in body, but in spirit. The world that had survived was haunted by what it had seen. For the survivors, life would never look the same again. Fear of death became part of daily existence. Parents who had watched children die, husbands who had buried wives, priests who had seen their entire congregations vanish. None of them could return to the old illusions of safety. Life was fragile. The shadow of the plague lingered in every village, every memory, every prayer. This trauma seeped into culture. Writers like Giovanni Boccaccio captured the chaos and despair in works like the Decameron, tales told by those fleeing the pestilence. Artists filled church walls and manuscripts with grim images of the dance of death, skeletons leading emperors, bishops, and peasants alike into the grave. Music turned mournful, prayers darker, literature more urgent. The Black Death had carved mortality into Europe's imagination, and that scar never faded. Today we call this catastrophe by its chilling name, the Black Death. And modern science tells us what it truly was. The bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on black rats. Its symptoms were unforgettable. The sudden fever, the grotesque swellings, the stench of rotting flesh, the bloody coughs. For those who lived through it, it felt like the end of the world. And yet humanity endured. The survivors rebuilt. From the ashes of despair came new art, new ideas, and eventually a new age. The Black Death did not destroy civilization. It transformed it. Its echo has carried forward through time. The Spanish flu of 1918, which killed over 50 million people. The long shadow of HIV, AIDS, SARS, Ebola, and most recently, COVID-19. Each outbreak has reminded us of the same truth. The battle against disease is endless, and our place in the world is far more fragile than we wish to believe. The Black Death was not only about death, it was about how societies respond to catastrophe. It showed that fear can divide, that faith can falter, but also that from ruin, new life and new ideas can rise. Its legacy is written not only in graveyards, but in the way Europe changed forever. And its final lesson, across 7 centuries, still whispers to us. When the next great shadow falls, will we be ready? And what kind of world will we leave behind? If you could go back to those dark years, If you stood in a city where death stalked every street, what would you do? Would you run? Would you hide? Would you pray? Or would you fight to endure?